because when you look back at all of the signs and all of the prophecies, he fulfills everything. So why do we study the Old Testament? It's all about the big picture. The big picture, sorry. Okay, so the big picture is human history, which is fully and perfectly manifested with the incarnation of God the Word. Essentially what it means is that from Genesis to Revelations, everything is connected and everything makes sense. It's not like, oh, let me pick up this story and then, oh, that was a good story, let me start a new one. It's the same thing. It's like picking up Harry Potter books 1 through 7, right? It's all connected. It's not just random. So there is an interconnection between the whole Bible, and the relationship between God and man is constant and a crucial theme. If anything, it is the full situation why we have the Bible, to show us that to show us the relationship between us and God. Understanding this helps us with the unity of the Old Testament and the New Testament. If we know that the essential factor is our relationship, then it makes more sense as we read. Because I know you guys have tried to pick up the Old Testament before, and you're like, what is going on, actually? Like, what's going on? Like, there's a bear, there's a mashad fe'i, like fi'i. And if you look at it through the lens of, okay, this is preparing for Christ, okay, this is talking to me about my relationship with God, it makes a lot more sense. So in reading the scriptures, we should never lose sight of the fact that each of us is personally a participant in this story. We're not mere observers from the outside, but we're invited into the story to have our own meeting with God. So like I said, it's not disconnected. It centers around the relationship with God, and we'll get a little bit into that when we talk about the first chapters of Genesis. So I'm going to send you guys this PowerPoint too, but the book of the Old Testament, the books of the Old Testament really have some sort of system. So it's really small, but I will tell you exactly what it says, and then when you have the PowerPoint, it's easier to read. So it starts off with the early world. The early world is the first few chapters of Genesis, the creation, Adam and Eve, and the fall, okay? Then it has the patriarchs, so Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. Then it has Egypt and Exodus, so the stories of Moses. The desert wanderings, which is in the book of Numbers, more of Moses until Deuteronomy. Conquest and Judges, this is when we start getting into like Ruth and like Joshua and the walls and all of that. And then you have the royal kingdom, which is 1st and 2nd Samuel and Kings, so you're talking about Saul, you're talking about David. And then you have the divided kingdoms, so more of like Solomon and things like that. Exile. And then kind of like, those books towards the New Testament that we never really touch. That's the rest of the sections. So you have like Ezra, Nehemiah, the Maccabees, and then we get into the New Testament, which is the Messiah's fulfillment of the prophecies and the modern church. So that would be the Gospels and then the epistles, okay? That's how the Bible is divided. So there are 14 books in all. 12 of them have periods of history, and it helps us to understand chronologically, such as like the divided kingdom section, the exile, and then the return. So if we look at the Bible as a story of our salvation, even now, as it mimics us, it starts to make a lot more sense. So for example, with sin, we sin, there's a division, there's a period of, being away from God, and there's a return. Very similar to the things that are happening in the Bible, very similar to the story of creation. There was sin, there was a new covenant, and a return to God. So it kind of plays out our life in a way, which is why it says we're active participants, we're not just observing. So this is just something I would sort of memorize. I'm not going to spend too much time on it just because we don't have time to spend on it, but it's covenants and the relationships between God and his people. So Adam is taking on the role of a husband in the form of marriage. And the sign or the covenant, by the way, means promise or oath. The oath that we have for this is during the creation, God gave us the Sabbath in which we were going to praise God, and here we are in the Sabbath, right? So that is the oath. That is the form of the covenant, the physical form of the covenant. With Noah, he's the father, right? He pulled his family together, got them on the ark. So the form of his leadership is household. And then the sign that God gave him as, okay, we have a new covenant now, we have a new promise, a new oath, is a rainbow. And Abraham, he was the beginning of basically the tribes of Israel, right? From him, all of the descendants came. So it started off with tribal chief in the form of the tribe, and then the covenant that God made with Abraham is circumcision. So Moses is one of the first judges, right? He came to Pharaoh. He's like, let my people go. After that, he led the people through the desert, gave them the 10 Commandments. So it is shown in the form of a nation. And the covenant that God made with Moses was the Passover, right? If you have this blood over your door, I will not touch you. That's the promise that he made with him. David, he was a king, and then he had a whole kingdom. And then the covenant that God made with David is the throne, right? This was the blessing that God gave to David. He was like, you are my chosen. And then lastly, we have Christ, who is the royal high priest. Obviously, we are all under this, the universal church. And the covenant that Christ made with us is the Eucharist, right? Whoever takes my blood and, eats my body, drinks my blood is in me and I in him. That is our link. So remember that chart that no one could see that was really microscopic? So it starts off with the early world. So that's what we're going to talk about first. So the early world, as I said, consists of the first 11 chapters of Genesis. We can outline it through this way. It starts with the creation and then the fall, and then the sin of Cain and Abel. I should just say Cain. And then Noah and the flood, and the Tower of Babel. Are we all familiar with these stories? It's crucial that we're familiar with these stories. Just as a refresher, the Tower of Babel was when people thought they could reach heaven through a tower, and they all, spoke the same language. And we'll get into a little bit, but I'm not going to tell you the whole story. Essentially, it was basically like we're more powerful than God kind of move, and it's a form of sin. So we can understand then that the significance of the early chapters of Genesis is not in providing a scientific or historical view of the beginning in nature, but once again of this promise. So a lot of people will go up to you and be like, hey, if the Bible's real, then, how did the world get created in 7 days when we have evidence that, blah, 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 blah. And you go, well, the Bible isn't a history book or a science book. And then you'll take a little bit more in apologetics, how it actually sort of lines up, which is pretty cool. But point is, the Bible is a religious text. It is the story of our relationship with God. It is the story of our covenant with God. That's what it is. Anything else might be like, oh, that's interesting that fits in perfectly, very cool. But it's not the point of the Bible. The point of the Bible is to reinforce that promise or that covenant. So creation. God creates man in his image and his likeness and crowns him as the king and the pinnacle of creation. We know this, right? God made Adam ruler over everything. The number 7 in the Bible, all of the numbers in the Old Testament mean something. If you guys have ever listened to Abuna John take apart any book of the Old Bible, he will start off with numbers, especially Noah's Ark. He'll be like, okay, so there was this many planks of wood, and this symbolizes this, and this symbolizes this. And the reason that we look into the numbers is because if the Bible put it there, then there's a reason. So we're emphasizing the number 7. This number 7 is an oath in ancient times. That's what it represents. It's the number of completion. It's the number of promise. So there you have the 7 days of creation. You have the Sabbath. This points to the covenant. And once again, the creation story is not a scientific report, but it communicates a very profound theological meditation. So this is a little bit abstract, so bear with me. But if you guys kind of remember the chapters of Genesis, how it starts out, right? First there was darkness, and then there was light, and then all the processes, right? The way that it's written, especially in Hebrew, is very, very poetic. The English translation, I think, will never do it justice because there just aren't enough words in English to communicate what the text is trying to say verbatim. So what the poet is trying to say, or the writer of Genesis, is he's trying to say that the heavens act like the dome of a temple and the creation is the pillars. So together it points us to up, right? It points us to heaven, which is our end goal. Kind of abstract, a little bit harder to wrap your head around, but once again, if you keep in mind that this is all about the promise and covenant and salvation, it makes a lot more sense. And it makes a lot more sense as to why things are described in the order that they are described, okay? So when you read Genesis, it might be like, okay, I don't really see the poetry part, but once again, remember, it's translated from Hebrew, and the Hebrew origin is very, very poetic. So the important thing about the creation is that God desires to relate to us, not as a master to a slave, but as a father to his sons and daughters, as evidenced by the image and likeness. So a lot of times, maybe in a lot of different religious sects, we might get the impression that the only reason we don't sin is because we don't want to go to hell, right? It's pretty forefront, where it's like, only these 72 people are going to be saved, or, if you do this sin, then you're going to go straight to hell, or like the people with the signs, like, you're going to hell, like those guys. So that's not the point. Yes, that might happen if we, sin, but that's not the point. The point is that I have upset God. I have upset someone I'm close to, that I have a relationship with, my creator. I need to get that back. That's the whole point of our relationship with God. It is not supposed to be a punitive relationship. We are not supposed to feel like, we're being like moved around and being forced to do things like he's our master and we're slaves. He does not want that relationship with us. That is not a relationship he was after. That's not why he created us at all. He wants us to be family. We are his family. So he desires to relate to us in this way, not as, someone that lords over us, pun intended. For a man to be made in the image of the Trinity, he must be set in a communion of love. So God creates man and women in equal dignity. And I think some of you were here for the lesson that we had on the role of women in the church. Maybe some of you joined in Zoom, maybe some of you missed it. But what we were talking about in that lesson was that woman is not beneath man. Otherwise, God might have, made woman from like the foot, but he didn't. He made her from the side or right next to, right? But they are complementary, like, yin and yang. They complement each other. They go together. Together they bring out, oh my goodness. Together they bring out the whole image of God, okay? They mimic it, in a sense. So they imitate it. So in their relationship, the couple reflects God. And the Garden of Eden in this way, remember we talked about the promise being marriage in the first, the covenant was marriage in the first one, and the Sabbath, sorry, it was a Sabbath. But the whole idea was marriage between Adam and Eve. So that kind of makes the Garden of Eden almost like a honeymoon, and then marriage marks the high point of creation. Like, of all the things that God created, Adam was not happy until he had a partner. It was not complete until Adam was married, right? So that's the highest point of creation. It's a different lesson for a different day. But, of course, if there was the creation, then there was the fall. So man breaks the covenant with God in the fall. He turns his attention away from God as the goal of creation and makes it about the desire for what is created. So if you think about that, it kind of doesn't make sense, because it's almost like going backwards, right? Where it's like, if I made like a, I don't know, or if I wrote a book and you really liked my book, but you kind of didn't care about me or whatever, it doesn't really make sense because I made that book. So what else can I make, right? So you're getting rid of the source and taking something that the source created. That's what happens in the fall. So Eve did not eat the fruit to be like God, right? Satan told her, hey, eat the fruit, you're going to be like God. Surface level, she's like, oh, But that's not actually the sin, right? The sin was that she had a severe case of FOMO, right? She was like, what am I missing out on? What's going on? So fear of the missing out, of the unknown, starts to breed doubt. Once you have that seed of doubt between you and God, it starts to be more room to include sin. So, yeah, I think so, yeah. So the original sin attempts to abolish that fatherhood with God that we talked about, right? That relationship of father to children. And it wants to establish a master-slave relationship, right? So it's reducing the relationship and the quality of the relationship to something that maybe I don't want, right? What do we want to do when, they're slaves? We want slaves to overthrow their masters. So it starts to input this just false idea about how you look at God and how God wants to look at you. And it begins to be all about control. Well, God's just trying to control me. Why can't I do whatever I want? I want to do this. I want to do that. It's not fair. So when you have that, it begins to further push you away from God in the way that he originally intended your relationship with him to be. And this is evident from Genesis, right? Like this is from the first few books of the Bible, where it's like, hey, this was what I wanted. I wanted to have my children. I built them this beautiful garden. I, grew them all these trees. I put all of these animals at their dominion. And the moment sin enters, the children do what? They hide, right? They run away because they're afraid of the consequence. They're not afraid of losing that relationship. It was, if God sees me, he's going to know. And then what? Not, I have really angered God or I have really wronged God. What do I do? It's another thing. Which, if we think back on our own sin, might be how we react, right? Where it's like, oh no, if I don't confess this, it's not going to be good for me later. Is that how we look at it? Or do we look at it as, through this sin that I did, I feel really distant from God and I feel like I kind of broke that relationship or made him upset? That's very important. So after man falls, God is ready to proclaim his salvation. So what's really beautiful about Genesis is, yes, we have this seed of doubt. Yes, we have man kind of changing in his head that relationship that should have been something else. But we also have God ready to catch you immediately. So from the moment he falls, God is ready to proclaim salvation. It's called proto-evangelium, or the first gospel. Okay. And the Lord declares in the Bible, he says, I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and her offspring. He shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel. Who is he talking to? Does anyone remember?
Old Testament, very beginning, first people.
Yeah, Adam, but also who else? I will put enmity between you and the woman. I will put, no, not the woman. The woman is, no, Satan. He's talking to Satan. He's like, hey, from this moment on, there's going to be a war between you two. Yeah, because he separated them, right? So in this moment, God basically establishes his blueprint for Christ, where he's like, no problem. I'm going to send a fixer, essentially. But we still have to go through the rest of the Old Testament for that fixer to get there, right? So here we introduce the idea of seed or descendants. Christ becomes the new Adam who saves mankind in the end. So the other thing about the Old Testament is it sets up the lineage of Christ. So through the Old Testament books, we can kind of see exactly where we get Christ from, right? Essentially which tribe and which origin. So after the fall, there's the spread of sin. You have Cain and Abel, Noah and the flood and the Tower of Babel give us an insight to the power of sin and the decline of human nature. So just how bad can we be? So the story of Cain shows us that God takes issue with the heart rather than the offering. He's always cared more about the upright in heart. If you guys remember, Cain was the one that had all of the animals, right? He would sacrifice whatever to God, and Abel was the one with all the vegetables. So Abel would bring, his best vegetables and give it to God and say, hey, this is my sacrifice. And Cain would bring, whatever calf and be like, this is my sacrifice. And God liked Abel's sacrifice more because of the pureness of Abel's heart. So you can kind of take that metaphorically and be like, okay, so we can perform all of the correct things. God, animal sacrifice, yes, it's very well known in the Old Testament. And then you got a vegetable sacrifice over here, which question mark. But we can perform all the right things, but if your heart is not in the right place, it's not going to matter. And Cain could have saved himself. It's not saying okay, he couldn't have fixed it, but what did he do instead? He killed his brother. So instead of being like, oh God, okay, let me see, what can I do to make our relationship better? He was like, I'm just going to kill the other guy because that's easier. So obviously, God did not like that. And so he takes more issue with that, right, than with, an offering of what you have, right? It's the same idea behind the tithes, right? The woman that donated the 2 tithes that she had, it's not a lot of money, but it's all she had, and she gave it willingly. Same idea. It's with your whole heart. So that is Cain. So Noah's story is a recreation of a new covenant. So remember, as I said, there's kind of a pattern. There's a covenant, we break it, we're exiled, and then we're saved, and there's a new covenant. So Noah's story is the recreation of a new covenant, But the Tower of Babel is the inability of man to remain faithful to the covenant with God. And the pattern continues. So these stories are important as the bloodline of Christ is starting to unveil. Like the more you're kind of watching it, where you're like, okay, it starts to sprout. So the flood is a story of our creation in which we receive a blessing and a new covenant. Remember the whole flood? Noah was like, guys, there's a flood that's going to come. And everyone was like, yeah, okay, whatever. And he was building an ark for like 100 years or something. And then the flood came, and then everyone died, except for him and his family, the believers, right? So after that, after they survived the flood, God told Noah, I'm never going to do this again to the world in this way. Like, I'm not going to flood you guys again like this. Here is a rainbow as a sign of my promise. So another covenant where God was like, there was sin committed, the believers were steadfast, the punishment was done, and I'm going to continually protect you from future things. So there was a covenant established there. So God wants to save humanity, but also he wants to bring back that interpersonal relationship, right? Where, he didn't have to do another covenant. He didn't have to, do anything. But he chose to because he wants to return that interpersonal relationship. Wants to remind us that, hey, I still care about you. That hasn't changed, and that will not change. So every time we fall, there's, God to pick us up again. So if we go to the Tower of Babel, this literally the words meant gate of God in its original language. Sin had before created division. Remember, Adam and Eve had sort of divided. Cain had divided. Cain went into exile, all that stuff. But now the Tower of Babel was very interesting in its way of sin because it created unity. So people were united against God. And I think maybe you guys can think of some examples in the modern day where everyone is telling you this is right, and it's not. It's what we view as sin or taking us further away from God. So basically people built an artificial heaven on earth based in its own strength, power, and wealth, which once again has a lot of connections to even the modern day, right? Things with strength, power, and wealth are usually looked at as like, oh, yeah, this is good, no matter what. However, even in this sort of destruction of the Tower of Babel, we get the line of Shem, who would lead us to Abraham, and Abraham will eventually lead us to Christ. So now we're going to take apart some of the fathers, some of the patriarchs, but then we're almost done, which is good because it's 12:45. So starting with Abraham, the world ends with Babel, okay? The early world, sorry, not the whole world, the early world. So remember we had that little chart that no one could see? It starts with the early world. Now we're in the patriarchs, right? So the early world ends with Babel, and now we begin the period of the patriarchs, starting with the obedience of Abraham. So God calls Abraham to leave his homeland and come to a new land that God has yet to make known. He includes a promise of a nation, a name, and a universal blessing, a threefold promise. So Abraham's story is a little bit long, and maybe we kind of mix it up with other people, but bare bones is Abraham was very devout. God was like, hey, I need you to go to this land, and if you do so, I will give you a blessing. So it's 3 blessings, a nation, a name, and a universal blessing. So, as I said, everything is symbolic. So the land was fulfilled with Moses. Remember, Moses took everyone to the land of Canaan, overflowing with milk and honey? Yeah? Okay. A name, royal dynasty, was fulfilled with David, right? David basically was part of like the golden age of Israel, you could say. What did I do? Go back. It's black for you guys, right? Yeah. Okay. And then the last one, which was a blessing, was fulfilled through Christ. Obviously, the ultimate blessing is salvation. So when God called for Abraham to leave his homeland, he was still named Abram. I don't know if you guys remember that. Anyone remember that? Abraham had a different name? Abram, yeah. So before he left his homeland, his name was Abram. When Abram obeys God and God blesses him and makes, another covenant with him, he tells him that he will be the father of many nations. And at this point, he is renamed to Abraham, meaning father of many nations. This was the one where he's like, I will make your descendants more numerous than the sands of the sea or the stars of heaven. Yeah. So that was that covenant. And though Abraham doesn't see the depth of God's promise, God still blesses him throughout his life. But as we saw, the 3 promises are fulfilled over much longer periods of time. So he doesn't see the full depth of God's promise, but we see it through the Old Testament and the New Testament and today. So Abraham reacts with complete obedience to God throughout his entire life, though this is not for a lack of love for anyone else in his family. So, for example, Abraham was Isaac's son. What do we know about Isaac? What's the major Isaac story? He was going to be a sacrifice, right? So God one day was like, Abraham, I need you to take Isaac, your son, and sacrifice him to me. And Abraham was like, okay. And he just took Isaac and was like, hey, let's go. Without any, and a lot of people, I know a lot of people that like aren't part of the faith, for example, will look at that and be so weirded out. They're like, this is not normal. But there's a reason for why. So, first of all, in the text, Isaac was referred to the son as whom you love. And that makes us know that Isaac was extremely important to Abraham. It wasn't just like, one of, 30 kids and, just pick one and go and whatever, as long as you sacrifice one, it's fine. No, he was very loved. He was the son that was part of God's promise. So it's basically God being like, hey, I need you to kill the promise that I gave you. That's what it sounds like, right? Go kill Isaac. So at the same time, it's important to draw attention to Abraham's other son. We know about Ishmael? Yeah. So Ishmael was older, and around the age of 3 for Isaac, he was expelled, kicked out of Abraham's family. However, there's a parallel between Genesis 21 and 22, in which God sends an angel to Abraham to stop him from killing Isaac, and he also sends an angel to guide Hagar to a well so that she may save her son. So even in the midst of this super big, symbolic thing, we still have God protecting everyone. So God shows that his justice is universal. It's not just about, hey, this is the promised son, so I'm only going to care about the promised son, and I don't care about everyone else. It's about everyone, right? It's about Ishmael, who was, kicked out, but it's also about Isaac, because, Ishmael just left without, there wasn't like he killed his brother or anything like that, like Cain. It was just, it's unfortunate, it didn't work out. You guys should read the chapter to find out more, etc. But point is, he wasn't Isaac, and God still cared about him. So we often see that Isaac is depicted as a young boy in most pictures, but it's actually thought of that he might have been around teenage age around the time that this happened. So it's not like Isaac was going and he's not a child, right? He's not like, okay, let's go, Dad. He's like, okay, Dad, let's go. He's kind of like your age. There's some critical thinking skills that are there. So Isaac even continued and went. So what made Abraham trust in God so blindly? Abraham and Isaac, actually. Abraham had the utmost belief that God would raise Isaac from the dead if he was to kill him, because that is the promise that God made to Abraham. He said, I will give you this, this, and this. And we're starting with Isaac, part of the promise. So there was no doubt in Abraham's mind that God was going to break his promise, which is how we should be in our relationship with God. There should be no doubt in our minds that God would ever break his promise of salvation to us. As long as we're having that relationship with him, that faith, there is no reason that we should ever fear anything, especially from God, who is, as we see, consistent from the beginning. So Abraham displays the utmost faith and trust in this covenant and in his relationship with God. So then we move on to Jacob, one of Isaac's sons. So what do we know about Jacob? He stole the blessing from his big brother Esau, right? So Isaac was super old at this age, couldn't see anything, and Esau was older. Jacob was kind of pushed by his mother because, his mom really liked him. She's like, Jacob, you should get the blessing. You should, get the blessing. And then Jacob's like, okay, let me sneak and get the blessing. That's essentially what he did. So he stole the blessing from his brother, goes through a bunch of stuff for it. And the issue with that is that Jacob was the intended to be blessed, but he did not trust in God. It's sort of like, that you're going to get into a school, but you're going to cheat your way into it anyway. Even though you're going to get in. You're guaranteed to get in, but you're doubting. So you're going to, go into the admissions office and stamp accepted early on your application because you want to be sure. So the issue with Jacob is that he did not completely trust God. Jacob eventually, after, a while, returns the blessing to Esau as an act of restoration, right? So what he took away, he gave back. stating that God has dealt graciously with me because I have enough. So everything that God gave him, when he grew older and wiser, he was like, God gave me enough. I don't need to steal to take from you. Like, God has dealt graciously with me. I'm okay. So while the blessing as it relates to the headship in the family is both spiritual and political, remains with Jacob, he offers what he can to his brother. So at this point, he was still like the patriarch of his family. But still, it's about that brotherly love where it's like, I wronged you, but I'm going to return to you and apologize and give you what was yours and offer you what else I can. So this lesson of brotherly love foreshadows the New Testament teaching that love of God and love of the neighbor are intimately intertwined. Remember how you see things where it's like eye for an eye, and then people are like, well, it says eye for an eye in the Old Testament, but in the New Testament it changes that. And this is why we say no, nothing changes. It's here in this example where it's like, hey, it's both. It's at this point in time you needed this law, but this is what God intended. He intended for that brotherly love always. Love thy neighbor, don't hate your enemy. All of these things were completely intentional from God from the beginning. Okay, perfect. Joseph. So Joseph is the last one we're going to talk about. So what do we know about Joseph? Yeah, his brothers hated him. He had a really pretty coat, and they were very jealous, and they tried to kill him. Yes, so he's almost murdered by his brothers. There's a lot of, hate in this story at the beginning. Not completely from Joseph's end, too. It's also like a lesson, to like maybe like parents, where it's like if you're going to favor openly one child over the other, it's not going to breed very good sibling connections, right? Everyone looked at him and they were like, hey, why does dad love you so much? And we have to go work, and you get to sit here and be all like, fancy and learn stuff and weave and whatever. So it was very much like a relationship that had been building over time of anger. So Joseph is almost murdered by his brothers, but his brother Judah intervenes and saves him by saying, hey, why are we going to kill him? Let's just sell him, get some money, and then not have his blood on our hands. Like, we're clean of this. So they cover their sin by dipping his coat in goat's blood and go to their father Jacob. Now remember, Jacob was deceived before, or he deceived, and now he has been deceived. Goes around, comes around situation, right? You don't ever kind of escape that kind of stuff. So Jacob is deceived just as he once deceived. Yeah. Oh, yeah, okay. So the importance of the theme, right, of Joseph, the most important thing about Joseph is that the Lord was with Joseph always, that it's repeated many times in Joseph's story. It's repeated twice when he's sold into slavery. It's repeated twice when he's falsely thrown into prison. He goes through trials and sufferings, being accused of things he did not do, being accused of oh, you tried to, sleep with my wife, or, oh, you were lying to me about Mashat Fa'eh, and each time he was innocent, but each time the Lord was with him because he stayed steadfast in the Lord. He never did anything that would compromise his relationship with God to save his own skin. That's the bottom line. So because of that, God did not leave him. So Joseph remains loyal to God and his faith, which allows him to proclaim that God can interpret Pharaoh's dreams, not himself. So it goes as far as, towards the end of the story where Pharaoh's like, how are you doing this? And Joseph's like, it's not me, it's my God. And he's able to kind of preach a little bit about God to Pharaoh. And Joseph is content in whatever state he finds himself in because he knows he's able to do everything through God. So even when he was in jail, he's in jail for a while, and he stayed steadfast in God. He was content because at least their relationship was great. He had a great relationship with, his creator. So there was no issues there. So in conclusion, throughout the book of Genesis, God's blessing to mankind is passed on. We have several different covenants. They're maybe changed, not changed by like words, but I mean like they take different forms, right? First you had the Sabbath, now you have the rainbow, now you have circumcision, now you have this. But it's still the covenant that's being passed down from generation to generation to generation. And now you want to pay attention to the prophetic symbolism of Genesis, right? So Christ is hidden throughout the Old Testament. Think of the sacrifice of the father of his beloved son, maybe, with Abraham, or Joseph being sold into slavery, maybe a little bit reminiscent of a man named Judas and a little bag of silver, things like that. So when you start to look at the Old Testament like that, it starts to become very revealing. Okay? Any questions? Commentaries? Curiosities?
So there's one thing you can take from the Old Testament presentation today, it's what? You can take one thing from the presentation today, what would it be?
What? I heard mumbles. Someone say something louder. Mm-hmm. What's
New
our...
Testament foreshadows the New Testament, and you can't have a New Testament without an Old Testament.
Mm-hmm. Circular thinking.
Everything that happens in the Old Testament comes back to show up in the New Testament somehow.
Yeah. What's the key word? What? Say again? Christ is hidden? Okay. What's one key word? What's one key word that I kept? Covenant. Covenant, yes. Covenant is your major keyword.
And despite the appearance of the Old Testament being old and, I don't know, seems to run on sometimes, there's not one wasted word in the Old Testament. Okay? We're going to get real deep into this, and then hopefully this nice looks good.
Yeah, I have to figure that out.
And then we're going to need this to, you can send them to the group.
Yes.
So that people watching online can watch along with you.
Oh, yes.
Because right now we're just be helping out.
Awkward.
Any questions, guys? For those of you interested in your test last week, I
Oh my
them
goodness,
in the
PE.
car. I have, but I also have your grades here. All you're interested in grades.
What's
I know you
happening?
just take it, so I have it for you. And there was another person. Who? Marie. Okay. So I have to go to the car and get them for you. But you can hang around here. I'll give them to you right now. I have that's for you. Just take a little seat in the corner and you can work on them. You have half an hour, or else I give them to you. 4 of you did not pass last week. Okay? There were 4 of you who did not pass. Should I say the name of the But 4 did not pass. So for those who did not pass the test, you can talk to me after class when I'm giving another exam, and we can discuss what we need to do. But in short, if you didn't pass, I will give you a 1 makeup chance on the test. It just can't be the same test. So I'm going to have to rewrite it. Okay? So once I rewrite it, because if I give you the same exam, I just give you the answer last week. So I'm going to rewrite it. It'll give me a little bit of time. And give you another exam. If you don't pass that one, it's already very generous of me to do. But if you don't pass that one, then you'll have to repeat the physics module eventually. But if you passed, and you know you passed, you're all set. Put your sticks, and then we don't repeat tests again at the end. It's individual tests for individual modules. So, pass your sticks, you're done. You pass, you'll be done.
I need a picture of you guys for attendance. Everyone lift up their head.
Heads up.
Unless you don't want attendance. I mean, it's up to you. Thanks.
Okay, I'll be right back with the
I mean, I just want to remember whose face was here on this day in particular.